So, ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning this session 2, which is a panel discussion on global value chains, perspectives from business leaders and policymakers. The speakers for this session are Mr. Simon Darnell, Procurement Officer, Infrastructure Support Team, United Nations Procurement Division, the UNPD, Madam Dennis Brindley, Senior Energy Advisor, Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development, Madam Madhumita Ramanathan, Assistant Vice President, Invest India, Mr. Mohammad Salimullah, Senior Assistant Secretary, Policy, Ministry of Industries, Bangladesh, and Mr. Sachin Chabra, Head Procurement and Supply Chain, India Bombardier Transportation. I will request Mr. Yashwant Varekar to kindly step up on stage and welcome and felicitate the moderator as well as the expert speakers of this session with mementos, beginning with the session moderator, Madam Viviana Araneda, Head Global Value Chains Division, General Directorate for International Economic Relations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you. Let us begin with Mr. Simon Darnell, our speaker. He is the Procurement Officer, Infrastructure Support Team, United Nations Procurement Division, the UNPD. And then we have Madam Denise Brindley, Senior Energy Advisor, Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. Ma'am, a bouquet of flowers and a memento for you. Hearty welcome to you. Madam Madhumita Ramanathan, Assistant Vice President, Invest India. Thank you for joining us. And then we have Mr. Mohammad Salimullah, Senior Assistant Secretary, Policy, Ministry of Industries, Bangladesh. And Mr. Sachin Chabra, Head Procurement and Supply Chain, India Bombardier Transportation. Thank you so much, Mr. Varekar. You may please take your seat. While I quickly introduce our session moderator, Madam Viviana Araneda. She is in charge of the design, promotion and implementation of trade policies related to the insertion of Chile in global value chains. An economist, University of Chile, and also holds a master's in environmental management from the Yale University, has more than 15 years experience in international trade and environment. With those words, I request Madam Viviana to kindly take charge of this session.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. This panel is about perspective from business leaders and policymakers. So we have a very diverse participation of people with different backgrounds. This is the final session today, before we visit the exhibition and then the much awaited reception and the cultural program. So I think we have something that is going to be of the most interest for us. Before we get started, I would like to thank the organizer for their great work in putting together this summit, which until now has been flawless, and I have no doubt will continue to be. Please let me introduce the first speaker from the United Nations Procurement Division, Mr. Simon Darnell.
Anyway, thanks very much for that welcome. I feel like I'm representing the whole of the United Nations, which would be possible, of course. It's a very complex organisation. What I intend to do this afternoon, just very, very quickly in the next few minutes, just to give you a very quick overview of procurement with the UN, how to identify business opportunities, my thoughts on global value chains and MSMEs, and what we do to encourage both of those, and a few constraints as well, because we're purely on the demand side. You'll see the term there, United Nations Secretariat. That's really the United Nations headquarters and the part of the UN that runs the whole organisation. From a procurement perspective, we concentrate on the headquarters itself in New York. The other headquarters offices around the world, you'll be familiar with Geneva, Rome, Vienna, those sort of offices. All the red dots are the peacekeeping missions. Obviously, we're centred on Africa and the Middle East at the moment, and the blue dots are the sort of residual international criminal tribunals, which have their own procurement requirements. Just a quick look at some of the goods and services that we procure. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but a mix of headquarters function goods and services, and also everything needed to run the peacekeeping missions, aid missions around the world. Procurement division itself, UNPD, United Nations Procurement Division, based in New York. Again, I could absolutely bury you in statistics, but the main statistic there is right at the bottom, that out of New York, for those goods and services I've just mentioned, in 2016 we spent just over $3 billion, which is not that big in terms of the whole UN, because the next slide is much more interesting. The total goods and services requirement in 2016 for the whole UN system, and that's not just UNPD and the Secretariat, that's all the other funds and agencies which contribute to the UN, was just under $18 billion. Now that's a much more significant market, and you'll see it's split fairly equally between goods at the bottom and services at the top. We're getting there. Business placed with Indian suppliers by UNPD, pretty low actually, only about $2 million. That's new business in 2016, so not too significant. And I think a much more interesting slide is this one. The research I was doing into what Indian suppliers contribute to the UN system as a whole in 2016. Just some highlights here. India was the second largest country supplier by value to the UN, at just over $1 billion US. The largest one was the United States. The Indian contribution is about 6.1% of UN procurement. 34 different UN organisations purchased from Indian companies. That just shows the complexity of the UN procurement system, and shows that it's very important, and I'll explain in a minute how you target those agencies. Goods of that total was just over $900 million. Some highlight goods and service goods were pharmaceuticals, contraceptives, vaccines, foods, beverages, domestic appliances and tools. Services made up another $162 million. Management, admin services, engineering, research, healthcare, transportation, storage, finance and insurance. There were 3,630 registered vendors with the UN, Indian companies with the UN, and I think very significantly, just over 2,800 supplied or actually received a purchase order in 2016, and that's a very successful strike rate. That's just off the top of my head, about 75% of Indian companies that were registered actually got a purchase order from some part of the UN. Only 83 of those had volume over $1 million in that year. So again, that's telling me that a lot of that revenue went to small companies, and in some cases very small companies. The main agencies that were purchasing from Indian companies were UNICEF, PAHO, which is the Pan American Health Organization, UNDP, the Development Program, the World Food Program, the World Health Organization, and the Refugee Agency. So a very wide spread of agencies buying from Indian companies. This presentation is an edit of a much, much longer presentation, which I don't have time to go into now, but just a very brief overview of UN procurement is that it is fairly standard, fairly similar across the board, but there's one theme I'd like you to take from today if you are interested in working with the UN, and that is registration is mandatory. There's a central registration portal. It's based in Copenhagen, Denmark. It's the United Nations Global Marketplace, ungm.org. and that is the start place for every registration by a new company with any part of the UN. There's a tender alert service. There's an awful lot of help from the UN GMN interactive guide. It's your start place for all registration, and it's for all agencies. So a company would go in there, do a basic registration. You'll see there's a selection page where you would tick the box for any UN agency you think you may have an interest in working with. The registration goes from there out to the agencies. It filters back, and then you get an advice via UNGM or when your registration is complete with each of those organisations. There are different levels based on the different level of business you might be interested in receiving. There are commodity codes which you would select to tell the UN what your company does. It's very straightforward, but it takes time. So I would recommend any company here who hasn't already commenced that registration process to let me know you're doing. I can certainly put you in touch with our resources if you get stuck. But as I say, it's mandatory if you're interested in working with the UN. I'm not going into the UN procurement system detail, but again, for the whole UN system, the procurement activities are based on the following 4 principles: that they meet the objectives and needs of the UN organisation, that they're based on fairness, integrity and transparency through international competition, that they demonstrate economy and effectiveness, and they give best value for money to the organisation. And those common guidelines cover all the procurement stages, so they dictate how the solicitation process is drafted, they dictate the evaluation criteria, they dictate the best value for money process, the financial rules and regulations, the committees which sit to evaluate bids, and the eventual tender awards. There we go, that's the UNPD website. Now you will, once you start your research into United Nations procurement, you'll see a lot of United Nations Procurement Office websites. They're all worth spending time looking at, learning more about that particular office, who are the case officers, who are the procurement officers, and who you have to get to know and get your information across to, so that they become aware of your company as well as the registration process. Mr. Guterres, still relatively new Secretary General. He's, in previous organisations, he's been known as an agent of change. He's certainly changing things at the UN. He's driving a lot of change initiatives, unsurprisingly centred around saving cost, centred around reducing the UN budget, asking all of us to do more for the same or fewer resources. But that's a common theme around the world. I think the UN is finally playing catch up with the rest of the world economy. Our budget is being cut, but it doesn't mean the actual revenue and the spending budget is being cut. It just means that our headquarters functions have to be a lot more efficient. Just moving on. I'll move on from that slide in the interest of time and get on to the crux of global value chains and how I think UN procurement influences them. We have a lot of small value acquisitions, typically including consultancy, one-off purchases of goods and services. We have any large value acquisitions with MSME, subcontractors and supplier overseas as part of the supply chain. And this very commonly happens for systems contracts, where you have a company holding a contract in one country and subcontracting its suppliers overseas. The UN places no barriers to working across borders, so in principle, any company from anywhere in the world can bid for work within reason in any other part of the world. We encourage the registration of MSMEs, especially from member states with developing economies and economies in transition. And construction work. I'm involved in a lot of construction work for the UN. This entails a high percentage of subcontracted value to smaller companies and MSMEs. Still on promoting global value chains and MSMEs, we encourage the adoption of the UN Global Compact by large and small companies. That's a voluntary code based on labour, economics, general welfare, and this helps the smaller companies down the supply chain. UN vendors must also supply with a more rigorous supplier code of conduct. Sustainable procurement is not mandatory. We are promoting sustainable procurement, but we're not imposing it down the supply chain because we're aware that has repercussions with smaller companies where it is a cost to them and may hinder their effectiveness in bidding. We have a sustained program of business seminars with a focus on developing economies and economies in transition, and we're measured on that. When I go back to New York next week, I'll have to report back on this seminar, what I've done to attract new companies, especially smaller companies from developing economies, to register with the UN. SMEs are encouraged to research how the UN procures certain goods and services and how they may contribute as part of a joint venture or as a subcontractor to a lead venture. And my final slide, sadly some limitations on the UN influence on global value chains and the input of MSMEs. The UN is purely on the demand side. We're a buyer of goods and services. So we cannot give preference to smaller companies. They're encouraged to register, invited to tender if appropriate, but they'll be evaluated in accordance with the published criteria with an award made generally on a best value for money basis. Although some UN procured goods and services will be derived from global value chains, the extent to which first-tier suppliers outsource overseas is their decision, and the UN may determine that this adds risk down the supply chain. So during the evaluation process, that will obviously be borne in mind in our eventual best value for money decision. And finally, UN requirements are often short-term and on an emergency basis, and an extended supply chain may not be appropriate. So there are. I didn't want to leave my presentation on a low at the end there, but so I just try and lift things a little bit and conclude by saying, from talking to companies today, and I've already collected a lot of business cards, I haven't met anyone yet who couldn't supply something to the UN. There's an awful lot of opportunity for smaller companies to supply to the UN. I hope every company here speaks to me today or tomorrow while I'm here, and if you're not registered, you get more information from me on how to register. And you'll see from my earlier slide on the progress already made by Indian companies and the percentage of those companies that are smaller companies that are, a lot of progress has already been made by Indian companies, but I'm sure there's still more to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I believe that at the first sight, one will recall that given the mandate of the UNDP and its strategic role as a buyer of goods, its involvement within GVCs will be quite restricted. However, after seeing your presentation, we can get a grasp of the role of the UNPD within GVCs, not just as a buyer, but also as a promoter of the insertion of SMEs and micro SMEs into GVCs, which is something very interesting for all of us. Our second panelist is Ms. Dennis Brinsley. Ms. Brinsley is a Special Assistant to the Secretary for Strategic Industry Initiatives at the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. In this role, she leads the agency in developing tactical requirement development and investment strategies for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Dennis, the floor is yours.
Thank you to the conveners of the Global Economic Summit for inviting Pennsylvania to speak to you today. What I'm going to talk about for the next 7 to 10 minutes is a very large investment that Royal Dutch Shell has made in Pennsylvania that will change the way Pennsylvania does business in the petrochemical industry. And the investment by Shell, which is around $6 billion, is to build the first ethane cracker in the northeastern part of the United States. The opportunities that come with the Shell cracker for medium and small enterprises are really related to the plastics industry. And so I'll make the connection between Shell's ethane cracker and a host of opportunities in the plastics industry in the next few minutes. For any of you that like a little light reading in the evening, there's been 2 primary reports that have come out in Pennsylvania highlighting the petrochemical opportunities that exist in what's called the Marcellus and Utica shale plays. Pennsylvania has an abundance of natural gas. With Marcellus and Utica together, we have the 3rd largest natural gas basin in the world. Russia is the largest, Qatar is the second largest, and Pennsylvania has the third largest natural gas basin in the world. As part of that natural gas abundance, we have what are called natural gas liquids that come out of the drilling hole. Two particular reports indicate that those natural gas liquids can support up to 4 to 5 world-scale ethane crackers, which will then produce from that feedstock the resins for the plastics industry. This map shows the landscape of both the Marcellus and Utica shale plays. The Marcellus is the yellow, and the Utica is the pink. And that is the extent of the shale formation in both Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and West Virginia. We have just outpaced Louisiana, and we are set to outpace Texas on the natural gas production in the United States. The blue figures on the map show all of the processing and fractionation plants that have been built to support the growth of a petrochemical industry. And the pipelines, which are clearly indicated by various colors, show the flow of ethane currently out of our region. The shell cracker is shown in the center of the circle, and it's right above Pittsburgh for any of you who have ever traveled to Pennsylvania. It will be the first, again, world-scale ethane cracker in the northeastern U.S., and it will produce a combined annual production of 3.5 billion pounds of what is called HDPE and LLDPE. That's high-density polyethylene and low linear density polyethylene. That's a lot of resin. It will be produced in pellet form, and it will be sent out to market to be made into any number of plastics that we use every day. As I stated, the ethane availability, which is shown on this graph, the blue line shows the increasing production through 2030, which will support not just Shell, but up to 4 additional world-scale ethane crackers in the region. One of the reasons that Shell's decision to locate there is so profound is that when you compare the price of ethane to where it's tracked right now at Mont Belvieu, Louisiana, by 2030, it will be 30% cheaper to make in Pennsylvania. So that's a substantial cost advantage to those plastics manufacturers who want polyethylene to make product. It will be 30% cheaper than where it's currently being priced. In addition to the cost advantage, we have a market advantage. Shell chose wisely in that Pennsylvania sits within 700 miles, or about 1,100 kilometers, of 70% of the polyethylene market in the United States. We also have shipping ports where that polyethylene can be taken to international markets as well. So I'd like to translate this for you in terms of what it means for the small to medium enterprises looking at opportunities in the plastics industry. Beyond just polyethylene, we have opportunities with propane to be turned into polypropylene, so there's an additional resin opportunity there as well. But it starts with the resin. Oops, those are backwards. Feedstock is the ethane and propane, which goes into resin through cracking. We have molders, we have tooling support in the industry, we have secondary operations, logistics, packaging, and finally I'll end here because I've just been given my warning on time. The objective in Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia is to build a world-class petrochemical hub. This location would be a secondary and redundant location to the United States Gulf Coast, which produces all of the polyethylene and polypropylene right now in the United States. We anticipate 3 to 5 ethane crackers, 3 to 5 PDH plants, 2 to 3 ammonia plants, inorganic chemical plants, and specialty plastics manufacturing. So that is something that will definitely drive the growth of small to medium enterprises. Those looking to invest should look at China, which just committed $84 billion to the Marcellus and Utica region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. In regard to your presentation, I believe that we have a closer look in terms of the industrial perspective, specifically toward the plastic industry, and what factors such as supply chains create potential for industrial hubs with higher values, higher value added, and direct insertion to GVCs for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This goes to show the vital contribution of supply chains towards the promotion of GVCs in a specific area, country, or region. Our third speaker is Ms. Madhumita Ramanathan. She is Assistant Vice President of Invest India. In her role as Assistant Vice President in Invest India, she is responsible for leading investor relationship. Additionally, Mrs. Madhumita has worked in financial services across investment banking operations, including equity trading, IPOs, trader surveillance, PL management, funding projections, and securities inventory management. The floor is yours.
A very good evening. I understand it's been kind of a very long afternoon, so I will try to keep it as crisp as possible. So I'm from Invest India, which is a national investment promotion and facilitation agency, where we help foreign investors to invest in India. And I'm here to talk about how there are challenges that the MSMEs are facing in India today, and how there could be potential solution with organized retail coming into India today. So to start off with, we see that the MSME sector is a huge job generating sector where nearly 80.5 million jobs have been created. Now the question is, are they all in an effective model today that will provide a long-term economic sustainability? That is the question. I doubt if that is the case, because there are quite a few challenges that the MSMEs face as of today. The first disadvantage that you see is that the entire sector is highly unorganized. A lot of MSMEs are importing cheap and less quality stuff to be sold over here. There is no branding and assurance. There is complete lack of an efficient supply chain, and their customer base is very local. They are not able to reach to the international markets or even to the rest of the Indian markets from the localities as such. And because of this, if they are trying to maneuver any of their products outside their localities, there's high logistics pricing that is involved. So I would like to take you through one example of an insufficient supply chain, where a farmer in Jharkhand who's trying to sell some tamarind, he has to go through so many middlemen, maneuver through these high-priced logistics with a complete lack of a supply chain in order to reach the consumer. As a result, he gets less than 10% of what the consumer pays for a kilo of tamarind. So what could be a potential solution for such inefficiencies faced by the MSMEs in India today? One of the potential solutions that we are seeing is bringing in organized retailers. Now, when global retailers like Walmart, Amazon, even Indian retailers like Flipkart and Fortune are allowed to be an organized retailer, the complete middleman goes away. Now, these retailers, this is where policymakers come into play, where they need to balance to ensure that the proper investments come in, where local sourcing becomes the key, which will provide the boost to the SME manufacturers here. The global retailers will retail the products made by MSMEs in India, and India is expected to be a $4 trillion consumer market by 2025. It's an absolute no-brainer that you have demand and the supply is there to meet. With these retailers coming in, it's new markets, new jobs, all ready for the MSMEs. From a job creation point of view, there is 1:8 direct to indirect employment that is created by these organized retailers, and for the space that is getting occupied by these huge supermarkets and hypermarkets, for every 300 square feet, one person gets employed. So going back to the example of that farmer from Jharkhand who's trying to sell tamarind, we introduced an organized retailer, Dabur, in that place. Dabur, directly sourced from the farmer, so that removed the middlemen completely. They were able to maneuver all the logistics part of it and integrated the entire SMEs into the supply chain, and then retailing a better product to the consumer, where they thought about actually innovating it and making it a seedless tamarind package. So with better packaging, better product, the consumer is paying the same amount and the farmer is now earning 10 times more than what they used to earn without a proper supply chain. It's not only about the logistics and the middlemen. If you go on to the next, it is about the exports. The world becomes an oyster for an artisan sitting in the rural village in India, where the entire global market is just a click away. You have examples from a few articles from the Economic Times that have drawn about where SMEs are able to sell online, and a craftsman in the northeast, a stonesman in Tamil Nadu, Mahabalipuram, has the entire market over there and is able to sell their crafts right up to the United States. Amazon, with 50,000 SME sellers, is able to provide 9 global markets as the global outreach for the SMEs today. But there is one key perceived threat with these organized retailers coming into India today. There's a perceived threat that with Walmart and Amazon coming in, all the Kirana stores will be wiped out. All the Kirana stores will run out of time. So what is that the reality? So I would like to show some statistics over here. From 2005 to 2010 to 2015, you see that the organized retailers and unorganized retailers have been growing simultaneously, and it's not that the organized retailers have grown, have eaten onto the unorganized retail. If you actually see in the future, the consumer market is going to become the 3rd largest by 2025, which means the pie is increasing, is getting larger for both small players and large players to compete and to succeed and gain simultaneously. So, a quick anecdotal example. The place I come from in Chennai, which had an area of 500 bungalows, now with the inception of so many flats, has 1,500 families. Obviously, a Kirana store and a Walmart can equally compete to serve those 1,500 families. A quick analysis. A global survey was done on similar emerging markets like India, where FDI retail was introduced in Sri Lanka and Philippines. And after a year, the SMEs found themselves to be 60% more positive in their business, versus comparing it to 2 other countries like Kazakhstan and New Guinea, where FDI was not introduced in the retail space and they were mostly dissatisfied. Coming to a survey done by CII in India, we see that employment, there seems to be nearly 50% of them seem to have a positive opinion about the employment that is going to get generated. So to sum it up all, we see that the advantages of the solution that is being proposed of bringing in foreign retailers into India is the SMEs get integrated into the global supply chain, a large number of direct and indirect jobs get created, wastage gets reduced with upgradation of infrastructure. There's a huge boost to exports with international markets being connected. There is better tax compliance and a happy, advantageous consumer. To close it, I would like to just talk about Invest India, where we are the National Investment Promotion Facilitation Agency, where we handhold investors from the idea initiation to business advisory and aftercare. The most important point which will hold of relevance to this talk today is the policy advocacy that we do, and which is where it'll make a lot of sense for us to work with the government to ensure that the policies are in place to have a win-win situation of getting foreign investment and at the same time benefiting India through local sourcing and reducing imports and benefiting the MSMEs in India. Thank you.